Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I want to acknowledge any political officials who might be joining us or policy leaders. I also want to say welcome to those of you who are joining us by live stream. I've already received some comments that you're linking in. I also want to acknowledge my family that's here with me today. Wave family. And as Abby's already said, thank you so much, Ashley, my co-author's wife, for joining us, coming all the way in from Indianapolis. Today we're launching our book, Passing the Torch, Preparing for the Next Generation of Leaders in Public Service. And it's so befitting that we're launching it here in the public program speakers, because the Clinton School Speakers Series really provided the environment that developed the ideas that birthed this book. Here at the public programs, we're a hallmark for public debate, open dialogue, and engagement with some of the most influential and powerful leaders in government, in the for-profit and nonprofit sector. Here in the public programs, we encourage the free flow of ideas, but with respect for others and their views and their opinions. So there are two major themes in our book. The first theme is this idea of succession planning and the role of succession planning in preparing for the next generation of leaders in public service. And we're going to talk about that in more detail today. But a secondary theme, more embedded theme in the book, is how do you motivate the next generation of leaders in public service? What does it take to encourage folks to choose this path as their career path? You know, we think this is the perfect time to have this dialogue about public service. It's the perfect moment in history. We're on the eve of a presidential election, right? So we're all looking around asking each other, who's coming next? Who do we pass the torch to? This fight for equity and justice and social change, it's a relay. And it's based on the premise that the race breeds new runners, and that those runners go on because of their love for democracy to keep going and to keep working. But it's all built in the context of where we are as a sector, as a country, and as the world. From some of the images we see now, they're portraying public service as going from being something that's noble to a truth or dare. It's almost like a gamble. So for these reasons, my colleagues and I, along with the dean of the Clinton School, we felt compelled to write this book. In the day in which we are living right now, people tend to hesitate moving into leadership in public service because they fear the scrutiny, or they're cynical about making it their career path. But our goal is that we be able to encourage youth people to think about and care about making public service their lifetime work. When I think about presidential candidates on both sides, when they would go into office, oftentimes they had such charisma for encouraging young people to run for political office or to take on public service. And so we really hope that the messages in this book and the information that we share will help to ensure that the talent that's in communities and in the workplace will take up the charge. So, as in the words of our dean, when baby boomers like us exit the stage. So with that, I'll turn it over to my co-author, Dr. Karl Besel.
All right, thanks a lot, Charlotte. And I do want to acknowledge some people as well. First of all, Charlotte, I think we make a wonderful team on this. So as soon as I started talking to her about this idea, she was right on board. Really couldn't have done it without her. Also wanted to acknowledge Skip has been very supportive of this work from the start. And those of you that are in academia is not always collaborative. Sometimes it ends up being highly competitive. So I knew that would make some people laugh. And really, so I mean, this really is unique. So I think Skip has really set the tone for this scholarship as well as other people to do similar projects. And of course, my lovely wife is here. And last time I was here, my entire family was here. So our daughter, she is busy studying right now. So as the dean of a school, I'm glad that she's studying at Indiana University Bloomington right now. Otherwise, she would be here. And I'd like to go ahead and start with a couple of stories that will talk a little bit more about our motivation. So I was here in the fall of 2009, and during that time, everything was going absolutely wonderful. And I remember having a conversation with my wife, and she goes, "Well, how's everything going?" I said, "Hey, everybody's great, but I do have one little problem." She's like, "Well, what is it?" I was like, "I need more suits." And I was like, "Well, why?" I was like, "You would not believe everyone that walks through these doors." So, one week it's Prime Minister of Argentina, the next week it's somebody like Tony Blair. And she said, "Well, it is a Clinton school, so don't worry, we'll get you some more suits." I was like, "Thank you very much." And so, yeah, she's the fashion expert in the family, it's not me. So even what I'm wearing today, believe me, she had a big part to do with that. And another reason was I also started to recognize some people that I had always wanted to meet. And there was, I think, one week that Taylor Branch was here. So those of you that have read his book, it's the Clinton tapes. And I remember going up to Skip and saying, "Skip, I've never met anybody that won a Pulitzer Prize. Is there any way that I can meet with him?" And he's like, "Well, sure." So, I mean, I was just in heaven thinking, okay, I'm going to have dinner with Taylor Branch, a couple of Clinton School students, and I was fine with that. Well, in the middle of the dinner, Kevin Johnson walked in. So Kevin Johnson, the three-time NBA All-Star, Phoenix Suns, for those of you that are as old as me to remember when he played, but he's been the mayor of Sacramento for a couple of terms. So, I mean, where else can you really meet people like that? Like, it seems like every week, well, it is every week, you have people like that going through the doors. I honestly didn't know very much about Little Rock at the time, but I figured out very quick that you really do have a lot going on in the school. And it was a motivation to me because as a former nonprofit director, I really felt like I was on my own. I had a wonderful education at Valparaiso University right outside of Chicago, in addition to being at the business school at University of Louisville, but really didn't get the speakers, wasn't exposed to them to the same degree that you are here. I think the fact that you have a relatively small graduate class and you really, it's very accessible, I think, so you do a lot with the setting. Taking that one step further, when I was a nonprofit director, not only did I not always have the same opportunities that the students have here, as far as like meeting executives from some of the biggest foundations in the country, nonprofits, but like also integrating that theory and practice. So like I saw this as being like possibly an area that we could do some research in. And sure enough, when Charlie and I looked at what was out there in the field, really very little is out in the field as far as how you transition from one generation of leaders to the next. And I think because you don't have that information out there, a lot of times it happens in, unfortunately, the wrong way because you really don't have planning. So let me go ahead. So this quote really gets at it, or this is kind of a summary of some of the literature that's out there. And I will say that the for-profit sector has been doing a lot of work on succession planning really for decades. So this first quote from 1978 really picks up on the central role that leaders play with any organization. Yes, there's a lot that goes into whether or not an organization is going to be successful or not. But, like a key component of that would be the CEO, president of the organization. This is especially the case with smaller organizations. So for-profit sector, research has been out there for a while in the nonprofit sector, and I'm talking about really all nonprofits. You're talking about your, like small YMCA in a rural area in Arkansas, or even, like a large one. So even like when we interviewed the president CEO of Kaiser Permanente, he said they've only had succession planning over the last 10 years. So it's a very recent occurrence, even with large nonprofits. So as you can imagine, this quote from the nonprofit sector, 1990, 1994, this is when you really started seeing people in our field saying, we need to do something about this. We need to have, like more intentional succession planning. And the study from 2011 really amplifies that. So in this study, they actually surveyed 1,600 nonprofit organizations. Half were 501c3s. That would be your basic nonprofit. So a hospital or even a YMCA would be a 501c3. 501c4, that would be if you're involved in some type of political activity. What they all had in common was that when they surveyed the executive, in addition to board members, when they asked the question, what do you think of succession planning? Should you plan out who the next leader is going to be? It was almost unanimous. People said, hey, that sounds like a great idea. Follow-up question, do you do it? No, we don't. So, great idea, but absolutely no planning. And I like this quote at the end. I think this rose glasses approach is something that a lot of nonprofits have taken for decades. You get used to having somebody who's a great leader or even a good leader. You become very comfortable with that to the point of complacency. So very little planning is done. And even, like this quote, this is from a study in Denmark. You see this not only in the United States, but you even see this in Europe. That succession planning is something that, I would go as far as saying that the research that we did for our book, what we saw was that even the term succession planning is something that almost sounds foreign if you talk to executives in Germany or England. So even the language isn't there yet. And as far as like our structure for the book, since there was already, like some good quantitative data as far as, like who's doing succession planning, who isn't. So we, I think, have the answer to the what question, but, like how do you do it? That's the question that we wanted to ask. So we were really picking up on that 2011 study out of Nonprofit Management and Leadership and saying, all right, we already know that most nonprofits are not doing succession planning. So what about people that, like really are engaged in doing this? Like, so that smaller group, like how did they do this? How did succession planning manifest itself? And here's where halfway into my talk, I want to thank some other people. I want to thank everybody that we interviewed for our book, and I see Dr. West is right here. So, you had some wonderful quotes in our book, and that's what we were trying to do, is really flesh out how this was done with those organizations that are ahead of the curve. So, snowball sampling methods. Essentially what that means is that we would start with one organization that we knew was engaged in active succession planning. And we would ask them, all right, well, what was your model for that? So out of that, we interviewed right around 20 executives, everyone from President CEO of Kaiser Permanente to CEOs of some small rural hospitals. So we really wanted to be comprehensive in the approach that we were doing. And we also made comparisons with Germany. So we interviewed executives at 3 different German hospitals. And I thought what was really interesting is that in Germany, their sector is very similar to ours in the way that they have almost as many nonprofits per capita as you find in the United States, and many are religiously affiliated. So 2 of the 3 executives that we interviewed were executives of either Catholic or Lutheran hospitals. So, I mean, it's a sector which is very similar to what you would see in the United States. It actually makes a lot of sense that when we were looking at healthcare reform back in the early 1990s, so when Hillary Clinton was looking at that, Germany was actually looked upon as being a potential model for the United States because they already had single-payer health care, but they had this dynamic sector where you had nonprofits competing against for-profits. And as far as best practice strategies, what we got out of those interviews is, number one, the board, not the chief administrative officer, needs to really start and implement succession planning. And I'll give you a case study based upon my own experience. When I was a nonprofit director, I was in my 5th year, and I told the president of my board that I was looking at leaving to finish off my PhD. And he said, oh, well, we're really sorry to hear that, Karl. By the way, is there any way that you could actually put together a plan to hire your successor? And I was like, well, I really don't want to do that, but being a relatively young man and not wanting to make a lot of waves, I agreed. So step number one, don't have your executive director actually pick the person that's going to succeed them. Really, the onus needs to be on the board members. And another reason why you do that has to do with being inclusive, actually embracing diversity in the hiring practice. The county where I was a nonprofit director was very homogeneous. It was just south of Indianapolis area. And when I was looking through resumes for who was going to succeed me, I remember doing this with the president of my board, and he mentioned with some person, he said, well, this person would be coming from the Urban League. I don't know if somebody from the Urban League would be a good fit for this organization. I was a little taken back when he said that, but it does go to show when you don't, if you aren't intentional with succession planning, I think that you could have implicit biases come out. Sometimes explicit biases coming out. So I think when you plan, I think you're going to take a more inclusive approach. So something that Charlotte and I found in this research is that probably most of the executives, they really didn't use the word affirmative action hiring, but what they did say was you need to plan based upon your demographics who your next leaders are going to be. And I like this quote from Bernard Tyson, president of Kaiser Permanente. It really shows how organizations, you have to do this years in advance. So every year at Kaiser, and just to put this in perspective, Kaiser Permanente, their operating budget is $62 billion. So if they were a Fortune 500 corporation, they would be number 10. This is a nonprofit, but a very large nonprofit. So just over the last decade, this is what they've done, is at each one of these meetings, the president of the board, the CEO, in addition to the entire executive staff, will say, these are people that we think need to engage in more leadership training, because in the next 5-10 years, we could see them moving up in the ranks.
Yeah, and our next piece with regards to best practices has to do with what Karl has already talked about, this idea around demographic changes. There's a lot of data in the book that talks about how the populations are shifting and the need for those people who are in the executive office to be more representative of the populations that they're serving. However, the idea of connecting an commitment around their values of diversity and ensuring diversity had not made its way to the succession planning process. So one of the best practices that also emerges from the interviews was this idea that boards need to be informed about the demographic trends that should inform their succession planning. And as Karl's already mentioned, the idea of using the term affirmative action is one that was somewhat of a hotbed. And I think you'll see that from some of the quotes. However, the reality between both the gender changes, the ethnicity changes across the field, they need to be more reflective in what we're seeing in succession planning. This is a quote from Karl Besel. He's the executive director of Heifer International. When we approached him about this idea of what role does diversity play in succession planning, he was crystal clear. On the front end, he said it's not about color, it's not about race, it's really about talent. So we made that as his preface on the front end. However, he went on to be very authentic about what the data shows regarding women in the field and the work that's going on at Heifer International. He talks very openly about it. He said when he first got there, he wrote a mission statement about the global development work that they do at Heifer International. And he talked about what the data said about the women leadership that are driving and being a part of that work. So he was comfortable in making a very bold statement during our interview that he says that when he leaves Heifer International, he believes that his successor should be a woman, just based on the diversity trends that we were seeing with regards to the work that women are doing across the field. And we saw that with other chief executives who talked about the need to make certain that our board is aware of the trends, not just the executive director, not just those who are on the front lines doing the program development, but that the board is very much aware of that trend. This is a fourth best practice that emerges from the data, is this idea of cultivating leadership from within should be a part of succession planning. Over and over, we saw examples of where people would come into the executive role or be hired as a chief executive, but not only did they not come from within that organization, oftentimes they didn't even come within the field. So what is the message that's being sent to people who work on the front lines in nonprofits if they're not being considered for being the chief leader at some point? So this idea of identifying, developing, and promoting people from within nonprofits is also an important part of succession planning. It allows you to keep all of the intellectual history. It allows the consistency and stability of the nonprofit to go forward because you'll continue to have that knowledge base that's been built up over the years as part of the work of the nonprofit. This is a great quote that I like. Sterling Spearin, he's the former president and CEO of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And he talked very frankly about this idea that large foundations, private foundations particularly, are notorious for recruiting people outside of the sector to then take the lead of the foundation. He said so many CEOs, they either come from academia, they come from government, they may come from the business sector, but very rarely would they come from within philanthropy. He made the comment, as you see here, that it's like, yeah, you could really work really hard here, but when it comes time to being promoted, it's not going to be you. And so this idea of creating a culture for developing, identifying, and promoting those people who are already on board, who already understand the mission, who are already committed to the work, to being the leaders within these nonprofits. And this is our fourth and final best practice that really emerges strongly from the data and the research, is the importance of board training and board development. We've already identified the role of board members in succession planning, but part of the hesitancy is that they're not trained around what that looks like. They are not a part of the process. They're not developed early enough in their role as board members to have the confidence in putting together a strong, successful plan. But there are ways to do it. And some of the interviewees that we talked about expressed processes that they utilized. One of them was the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. They talked very openly about being intentional and direct in developing their board members when it comes to their succession planning. This is a quote from Dr. West, who's actually here with us. She said that they did board training, especially utilizing some of these other nonprofits, Board Source, Center for Effective Philanthropy, and they talk about these issues with board members on a regular basis. Strategic planning, visioning, succession planning, All of those things that make up a board's best practice. And in fact, succession planning should be and is part of a board's best practice. So as we summarize what you'll find in the book, what some of the key themes are in the book, particularly around this idea of succession planning, one of the biggest takeaways is it does not happen organically. It doesn't happen on its own. It has to be an intentional development, comprehensive process that the leadership at both the executive director level as well as the board level make a commitment that that's part of the value of the organization. Leadership development, it has to be a piece that everyone is committed to doing. And creating a culture of succession planning is really part of the other best practice to walk away with, so that it's something that is naturally happening within the organization, that it's part of who we are, it's part of what we do, but it has to be cultivated. It has to be on the minds of the board members. It has to be on the thoughts of those who are seeking and wanting to be promoted from within the organization, that people should be able to rely on there being an existing culture within the nonprofit to support succession planning going forward. And what we found from those executives is that it is worth the price and the energy that is invested to be able to walk away with organization sustainability and growth. So we're back to where we started, right here at the Clinton School, in the Public Program Speaker Series. This idea of how do we keep the dialogue going? Where do we take the next generation of leaders in public service? We consider the Clinton School to be one of the biggest breeding grounds, a great fertile garden, if you will, for developing what the leaders will look like of tomorrow. We hope that you enjoy the book. We are going to do some book signings and take a few question and answers from this point forward. So thank you very much.
All right, well done, thank you. Anybody have any questions? Yes, Hallie.
Hi, y'all hear me? My name is Hallie Schaffner. I'm class 5. I'm also the chair-elect of the alumni board for the Clinton School, and can't wait to read this book as a board member myself and as someone who hopes to be a leader in the nonprofit sector. My question has to do with budgeting and budgeting for executive talent in the nonprofit sector. Dan Pilata was in Little Rock recently, and he talks about how the top 10 highest paid nonprofit executives are paid about 1% of the top 10 football coaches in the country. And I wondered if your research, if you found anyone discussing their hesitancy to increase a salary for hiring some talent in the organization, if that came up, if you saw any obstacles there.
I'll take the first piece of that, and I'll let Karl do that. Thank you, Hallie, for that comment, and that's the reality of where we live, right? If you want talent, you got to pay for your talent. And when we talked with Pierre Ferrari, he specifically addressed that issue, that the salaries when he first came in for some of their most demanding positions were so low, but the expectations for those positions were so high. So part of his role in creating this culture of succession planning within Heifer International involved raising the salaries and making those positions more attractive, because in order to get the kind of talent and keep the kind of talent that you need, it's going to require some sort of investment on your part. And providing that knowledge early on to the board also was one of the things that he said helped him to be able to make the case, to make the business case with board members around the importance of linking talent with their salaries. I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, great minds think alike. I was thinking about Pierre's quote right away, and he actually, this is how he started his interview. He said, if you're going to have good succession planning, you better pay people what they're worth, or at least come close to what they're worth. And in this case, he literally did double the salary for some of the country directors, because Heifer is serving countries all over the world. So he said this was a big part of it. And he also was planning 5 years in advance with his board, so that way it wasn't sticker shock. They knew that this was coming, and he planned accordingly.
Yes, got a question right here.
Hi, my name's Susanna Creed. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. And my question is in regards to kind of the balance between creating leaders from within an organization, but then also, I guess, balancing taking in outside of more objective perspectives possibly, because there is a place for consulting. There is a place sometimes when skills transfer over, even if somebody isn't necessarily from that field, but you also do want to honor the people in the organization. So I'm curious what your thoughts are in regards to that balance, where it might be and what that looks like.
Good question.
Yeah, that did come up quite a bit in the interviews, and I think that in general, probably most organizations don't do a real effective job of internal hiring. So most of the executives that we interviewed said this has been a problem, that we have people that probably are very talented, but since we didn't engage in succession planning, we didn't know who those individuals were. Or we thought for a variety of different reasons, a lot of times it was political, we just didn't feel like we could go in-house. So they thought, well, if we go external, it's going to take the politics out of hiring our next executive director. But across the board, the organizations that had effective succession planning, they actually had a plan for developing internal talent. So I would say for book number 2, it's probably one of those areas that we'll probably even put more of a focus on, would be hiring internally.
Alex.
Hey, I'm Alex. Dr. Williams knows who I am. I'm a graduate of the Clinton School, class 10. So you said that the onus is on the board to kind of create succession plans. However, nonprofits aren't for-profits. There are no shareholders. There's no group of people that are really kind of voting these board members in, except for the board themselves. How do you keep a board accountable to further some of these ideas and plans?
Well, I'll lead off on that, but then I'll also pivot to some of the people that we have in the room that are working with their boards, and day in and day out they've got this one-on-one. We have both Corey Anderson and Dr. West here who can speak to how you keep your boards accountable. You know, one of the things that a lot of the interviews talked about is this idea of exactly what you're saying, Alex. Nonprofits live and breathe off of volunteers. And the board members themselves, oftentimes they're there because, you know, this is their service. The goal is to make certain that, as one of the interviewees talked about, that the board members buy into the values of the organization, and that those values that are part of what makes the organization tick, that those are a commitment that each of the board members make on a regular basis. This idea of providing development for the board members. I think in some cases you might run across a board member who's very experienced at what it's required to be a top-notch board member, but other times people want board development and they need board development, and being able to offer that in a setting where people feel that it builds their own capacity for being a strong contributor to the board is another thing that some of the interviewees talked about, help to make those board members accountable.
Josh.
Hi, my name is Josh Snyder. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. Thank you again for coming out and talking to us about this. I think my question relates to, I've been struggling to find the best way to put this into words, but the question of applying these best practices to other levels of succession within a public service organization. Do you think that's possible? And if so, I understand, of course, the systems are different, but of course people are always moving up within organizations and people need to be prepared. Do you think that these best practices could be applied to that, and how?
Yes, I think it can. In fact, I think the operating term is that you really need to foster a culture of succession planning. And because you're fostering a culture, it's pervasive. It goes throughout the entire organization. So yes, I think at every single level, you need to look at, well, who is going to succeed this staff person? And I saw that I hate to say it, the hard way in running my own nonprofit. It was pretty small, an operating budget of less than $300,000. And when I had a staff person that took a job elsewhere, sometimes we were scrambling. So I learned very quick that I needed to have some kind of mentoring system in place. So that way it went throughout the whole system. And it does save you a lot of time and money in the long run. And I think I do want to clarify that succession planning, it may sound like it's something that, well, if you're a Kaiser Permanente or if you're a large foundation, hey, they have these huge budgets, so they could pay for all this leadership training. What we tried to do in this book is to really give case study examples not only of the large nonprofits, but even small ones. So what do small organizations do? How do they grapple with this? And it's doable. But I'll go ahead and quote Hillary Clinton on this, that I think the best performance-enhancing drug is preparation. So you need to prepare for this from the start. And I would say that something that really got in the way for a lot of directors is they were fearful. It's hard to talk about who will succeed you as a leader. I think they were anxious for their own job stability in some cases, so subsequently it didn't happen. And that's another reason why the board of directors needs to do it. And even a small nonprofit, you could just spell that in writing. Even if you're a volunteer, it's good to have a volunteer job description and be very explicit in your language saying, we expect you as a board member to help us with succession planning.
Yes, got a question right back here.
Hey, I'm Stephen Carnes. I'm a social work student at Euler, and I'm currently interning at Arkansas Advocates. Y'all touched briefly on board development and board training. I was wondering if you had any suggestions on what kind of curriculum or how to go about training the board for this succession planning. Thanks.
Sure. Some of the interviewees that we talked to utilize the experts in the field who do that. Some examples that we talked about were BoardSource. BoardSource is a national organization, a nonprofit, who specialize in the makings and the workings of effective boards. And utilizing them, having them come in and conduct regular sessions and engaging their board members on a consistent basis was one of the ways that they did that board development. The Center for Effective Philanthropy, there's a whole chapter in the book that's dedicated to just succession planning and foundations. They do the same thing. They come out, they can come to your premises, you can bring people in for training, and they have established curriculum that's already in place that nonprofits can utilize. So my word of caution on that would be look to the experts. There are people who've got all kinds of deliverables around this that speak to that and can really help your board members from an objective view get the kind of development and training that they need.
You know, I want to say, I want to piggyback on something you said, because you said the school has been a training ground for the future of and as I looked out, and I'm going to run the risk of getting myself in real trouble. Won't be the first time, won't be the last. But I want to, you know, as I look at Arkansas Advocates, and I look at Arkansas Food Bank, and I look at Arkansas Children's Hospital, and I look at Heifer, and I look at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, the Walmart Foundation, the Walmart Family Foundation, Arkansas, you just go through the list. There are Clinton School students, graduates in those organizations. These organizations are hiring Clinton School graduates, and they're working their way up, Hallie. They're going to those positions, and I'm really proud of the work of our faculty and the staff in developing these students that are in these organizations, and I appreciate the nonprofits hiring them. So, job well done, you and faculty. Second thing I want to say is that we're now going to get ready to sign these books, and I shouldn't do this, but I'll get in trouble again, so here we go. I've never announced graduation gifts early, ever. But if you're a second-year Clinton School student, don't buy this book. Okay, just don't buy the book. You can read somebody else's. First years, you're on your own. But second year, this one's for you. Okay, so you can read somebody else's. Don't buy the book. Just didn't want you to spend your money We're on your side, pal. And again, I want to recognize our faculty that are here who've worked with Charlotte and also were instrumental in helping formulate the ideas for this book, and the staff. So let's give Karl and Charlotte a wonderful round of applause. And they're going to sign the book. Please come buy a copy of this book, let them sign it, unless you're a second-year student. Thank you all for coming.